All right, Sean. So we're live now. Thanks so much for agreeing to chat with me.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show, Justin.
Yeah, totally. I think if I recall correctly, the way that we first came into each other is I came across your blog post on the history of Catholic anti-capitalism.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah, and then I was kind of looking through some of your other stuff, and I was like, I'd be interested to chat with this person. Also, I saw that you do your own podcast, so whenever I see that, I'm kind of like, okay, this person's probably down to chat, you know?
Right, yeah. I kind of feel like, the podcasting community, we got to support one another.
Yeah. Maybe we could actually just talk about that for a little bit real quick, because I was looking through yours today, preparing for this chat, and I noticed you folks are really consistent. I'm never able to find enough time to really have like a consistent regular schedule. I just kind of do it when I have the time and I feel like doing it. But I noticed you guys are super consistent, so that's pretty cool. Is that hard for you to do? I mean, especially like managing your other responsibilities?
I wouldn't say it's easy, but it's not too difficult. I mean, I guess unlike your show, if my understanding is correctly, usually most weeks it's just me and Paul. Paul's my co-host, and so we don't have to organize around guest schedules. So I guess that makes things easier. But
right.
But yeah, I mean, it's one more thing to squeeze in, and we do have a Patreon set up, but we're just beginning to get some donors. So it's one more thing that I have to do, and it's one more thing that I don't get either paid at all or paid much for. So yeah, it's sometimes hard to justify, but it's fun. Paul and I have been friends for a really long time, and ultimately it's like a good structured reason to talk to one of my closest friends. So I'll take that.
Yeah, that's awesome. So actually, while we're talking about it, why don't you tell us a little bit about the podcast? Because I was able to listen to a few of them, but not in too much depth. I'd like to, just, not able to find the time. So I noticed that it's basically one of the things you're trying to do with it is kind of unite, or not necessarily unite, but at least bring together in conversation kind of different ideological perspectives. And so that's something that kind of it's not so purposeful exactly with my podcast, but that's definitely something that my podcast is kind of that's become a part of this one way or another. So maybe you could just tell us a little bit about your podcast and what you're kind of how you do it, and who the person is you do it with, how you know them, and is it someone that lives near you, I guess? So you do it in person, or do you do it online, or just give us the rundown?
No, yeah, sure. So the show's called Impolitic. It's hosted by myself and my friend Paul Matsko. We both went to grad school together. We both did history PhDs at Penn State. And the concept of the show is weekly conversations between a libertarian and a socialist. So I'm the socialist, Paul's the libertarian. And we did this for a couple different reasons. Started doing the show. One was that, Paul and I were good friends in grad school, but then we both moved, and we were kind of bummed that we didn't get a chance to talk as frequently as we would like. And so we kind of felt like, structuring those conversations around a weekly obligation would put us in contact more consistently.
Nice.
So that was kind of like the personal reason for doing it. And I think in a lot of ways that's been kind of the biggest payoff for the show thus far. It's been nice to like reconnect with a friend, even though we both moved. But it was also kind of this post 2016 election thing. I don't think that we were thinking that, neither of us are like big believers that we need to find some sort of magical moderate solution, and that we do that by having conversations across the ideological spectrum. Right. Like I want to win and take power, and so does Paul. But I think we both also felt that like we were better at our respective positions because of our history of political argument than we would have been without them, right? So like I think I'm a better socialist because I regularly argue with a libertarian, and I think Paul feels kind of similarly about his chops as a libertarian. So I guess that was kind of like our philosophy as it were, that we thought that too much of the focus on like partisanship was on this idea that there's a magical moderate position that will emerge from conversations. And we just sort of felt like the real casualty of hyperpartisanship is that people don't get smarter and they don't get better at their positions because they don't talk anymore.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's basically the show.
Okay, that's fascinating. Yeah, I totally see that rationale. You're not really interested in, some sort of like common ground that you think exists between different perspectives, but you're interested in keeping yourself sharp.
Right. And, there are places where we find common ground,
Right.
But that's not really our goal, I think, in general.
Yeah, okay, that's really interesting. Also, I find interesting that perhaps a lesson from your podcast that maybe I need to think about is find someone to do podcasts with me on a regular basis instead of it being based on guests all the time, which I have to go out and find. Maybe I just find someone who I love talking with who will agree to do it with me, like at least maybe once a month or something.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that I kind of feel like that's the best way to ensure the consistency. But I mean, I really like what you're doing with your show. I mean, I like the fact that it's like very different conversations with very different people from week to week. Whereas Paul and I, like, we try to change it up as much as possible, but ultimately we only have our interests are finite, and a lot of times we wind up coming back to kind of similar themes on a regular basis. So there's a lot to be said about having a different guest for each specific episode. So
right, do you guys ever have guests?
Yeah, we actually just recently had our first guest. It was actually a former grad school colleague of ours named Bill Cosson, and Bill's an expert on 19th century Catholicism, and it was actually Bill who gave me a lot of the info that I used in the Catholic anti-capitalism post that you mentioned earlier. Like, I really know very little about Catholicism, period. And so I was just kind of interested in like the anti-capitalist dimension of it. And I think it was in the context of like Pope Francis had said something critical of capitalism, and a lot of folks were like, wow, the Catholic Church has never been critical of capitalism before. And that sort of struck me as being likely incorrect, and Bill helped me flesh out a lot of the points. So we had Bill on recently, and one of the things that was most interesting was just the realization that like the technical side of handling 3 audio feeds is it's a lot more complicated than handling 2 audio feeds. So yeah,
right.
The more people you get on a podcast, the more complicated it becomes.
Yeah, definitely. I've had some pretty bad little technical snags, even just having one guest at a time. This was relatively smooth. It only took me 5 minutes to get this set up correctly, so I've had some bad ones. Yeah, it gets tough. So why don't you tell me a little bit more about that piece in particular? We could talk about a bunch of things, but you said that you actually you don't know that much about Catholicism, but I know that you're kind of more, you're sort of a socialist or anti-capitalist, or you can tell me however you think about your own beliefs. So then how did you get into, why was that something that interested you, the Catholicism piece? Or maybe you could tell us kind of what the main upshot of that little bit of research you were doing was.
Yeah, I mean, little is the operative word.
Yeah.
I think I wrote it during my first year out of grad school, and I was really like basically just trying to throw a bunch of spaghetti against the wall and see what stuck, professionally speaking, at least. And so I was doing a lot of freelance writing, and half the stuff that winds up on my blog, it's pieces that I pitch to publications and they get rejected.
Right.
And so like, I throw them up there because, I wrote stuff, might as well put it out there, even if it's not going to be something I get paid for. So yeah, it was just, it was like one of those of the moment things. Again, I just seem to recall that, Francis had said something critical of capitalism. A lot of American conservative Catholics seemed really shocked by this. I thought that was wrong. So I did like a day of research and threw it up. Yeah, I mean, like you said, the anti-capitalist side was way more appealing to me. I mean, at that point I was identifying as a socialist, but I wasn't organized. I wasn't yet a member of a socialist organization. So, I guess I was like a baby socialist at that time.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Actually, I mean, just to shift gears randomly, because it's a podcast and you're allowed to do that.
Absolutely.
What you're actually just suddenly making me think about is I saw some of your writings about you actually tend to be sympathetic to kind of this culture of things like trigger warnings. And
right.
So I noticed that, and I thought that was kind of interesting because you are also a podcaster, and you especially have a podcast that kind of focuses on, kind of free and open speech. So I was wondering if there's, any tension there, or if you have any hesitations about the the kind of emerging kind of a culture of what some people would call political correctness, but what some leftists say political correctness is a myth. So I'm just curious, maybe you could tell me a little bit about where you come down on that, because just especially in light of the fact that you seem to also be interested in kind of open free speech.
Yeah, I mean, I insofar as I've written about trigger warnings, it was mainly to say that I don't actually see them as a major presence on college campuses, and maybe it's just the nature of the schools at which I've taught. I mean, I've taught at two big American state flagship universities, both in Pennsylvania and Florida, and I've also worked at a community college down here in Florida, which is where I now live. And maybe at like Yale or Smith or whatever, trigger warnings and safe spaces are a big thing. But whenever I mention them to students, they have literally no idea what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And for me, like a lot of the discourse around trigger warnings, it seems to be these folks who think that it's somehow the obligation of an educator to go out of their way to shock their students and make them uncomfortable. And I mean, I certainly think that education, part of education is making people uncomfortable, but I think that it should be the ideas themselves that make them uncomfortable rather than the mode of presentation, And so my example in the piece that I wrote about trigger warnings was basically like, when I show clips from 12 Years a Slave in my Civil War history courses, I warn people in advance that they're about to like watch a human being be tortured, and if they're not cool with that, I'm not going to give them a hard time. And I just sort of see that as common decency. It doesn't strike me as like some concession to the fragility of college students. And personally, I just don't tend to find college students fragile. I mean, again, maybe that's, rose-colored glasses. Maybe that's the nature of the institutions where I've worked. But I don't really see the problem of the culture of political correctness the way that a lot of commentators do. I mean, so what's sort of I know that you identify pretty militantly as like a free speech advocate. So, I mean, what's sort of your take on the political correctness issue?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I definitely tend to be just sort of temperamentally a free speech absolutist type. I mean, I think that generally we should, as a society, try to have the most open kind of speech norms possible. That's definitely where I come down generally. But it is interesting because I'm kind of listening to what you're saying, and I'm thinking about how, in my own personal experience as an academic, I actually haven't had much contact with, the infamous like student activists that are kind of much talked about right now. But in other ways, I have had a lot of contact with that, just as an activist, as a kind of someone who's been on the radical left for like about 6 years, really, since Occupy. So on the one hand, I actually have a lot of contact and experience with the leftist culture of wanting to basically police speech and behavior. But I am, as I'm listening to what you're saying, in my experience with students as a teacher, I did my PhD at Temple, and now I'm an academic in the UK, and so those are the only two institutions I've been at as a teacher. But that's, I guess I have like about 5 years teaching in the university under my belt. I've never actually had any particularly interesting episodes or run-ins as a teacher. So I think you're onto something in saying that, the sort of perception that there's, campus activists everywhere trying to shut down speech, and they're all like a bunch of, precious snowflakes, is probably, I think you're right that it's actually a relatively small minority, really, of students that could even possibly apply to. Most of the students don't really care. They're, I think a lot of academics and intellectuals get really into their like little internet debates, and they imagine that everyone else is like paying attention, and meanwhile, like most people in the world have no idea what the hell you're even talking about. And students, I think, do fall into that. So, So yeah, I think that's totally true.
It's interesting though. So, I mean, I guess my feelings are also informed by two sets of experiences that sort of pull in slightly different directions. So one of them, I don't know if this made the news in the UK. I don't even know if this made the news in most parts of the US. But I guess last fall, the white nationalist Richard Spencer spoke at the University of Florida, which is where I teach. and there had been a lot of efforts to shut down or to convince the university to rescind the invitation to Spencer. And I was very firmly in support of those efforts. And for me, I mean, this wasn't so much an issue of whether there should be prior restraint on Spencer's speech, but rather about whether a institution that represents or embodies the public should be in the business of inviting people who advocate the murder of like 1/5 or 2/5 of the student body. So I guess the Spencer event was kind of a formative one for me in terms of my thinking on this, because I saw people get silenced because of the presence of Spencer and other white nationalists on campus, right? Like folks left town. They were scared to come out of their buildings. There were faculty centers that were basically shut down for the entire week, right? So like there was a lot of speech that didn't happen. There were classes that didn't happen quite literally because of Spencer's presence. And I think that inculcated in me an appreciation for, to an extent, like the fact that sometimes, I generally think that speech is not a zero-sum game, but I think there are definitely instances where it is. And the Spencer thing seemed to me to be proof of an instance where it is a zero-sum game. That there were some people who were silenced because the university decided that Spencer, deserved to have a place on campus. So that was one thing that I think about when I think about free speech debates. But then I also think about an activist organization that kind of sprung up spontaneously in Gainesville, which is the city I live in, after the 2016 election. And, there was, in that setting, it was kind of this big umbrella, like Big Tent organization that was supposed to bring together both new activists and seasoned activists and activist organizations around opposition to Trump and Trump's agenda. And I definitely saw, a certain amount of like activist policing of speech. But ultimately, I think the thing that I realized was that while that policing of speech did alienate some people from the coalition, the kinds of speech that they were policing also would have and did alienate people from the coalition, right? So there was sort of like a lot of oblivious white activists or like newbie activists who showed up and were saying stuff that was not intentionally racist, but it was nevertheless racist. Okay. And folks like called it out and called it out really, really harshly and aggressively. I can't say with any accuracy that the call out was what like caused the coalition to break down, because you could just as easily say that the racist comments, which would have ultimately caused the coalition to break down. Does that make sense what I'm saying there?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think, you're introducing a lot of interesting points, and I actually think maybe we should pause on this and break it down a little bit, because I definitely disagree on a few counts, but you're, a very eloquent defender of that position. So this will be a good exercise, I think. Going back to one of the first points you made when you were talking about the Richard Spencer case, for instance. Now, what I think is interesting and difficult about this case is that, or cases such as that, is that I think I generally would agree with you that in cases where, to use a legal term, there's some sort of like clear and present danger. If a speaker is like literally, threatening or inciting violence in like a very concrete way, then I think in such cases I can understand and I'm somewhat sympathetic to that being a pretty bright line for where free speech ends. Now, what's interesting about people like Richard Spencer is that I completely understand the interpretation, like what you said about him, that, he's basically directly kind of calling for genocide or violence or this sort of thing. But the tricky thing here, though, is that people like him are very good at not literally doing that. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
And
yeah.
so,
I mean, he treads very close to that line.
Yes.
But rarely actually crosses it.
Right. And so that's an issue. That's a challenge, I think, and it's a vexing challenge, because we might kind of know what people like Richard Spencer are kind of winking at when they use, coded language or dog whistles or whatever it might be. And we might, have very good reason and make plausible inferences that they're beckoning or referring to, actual violence or things like that. But so long as they are treading that line correctly, and they are staying just this side of inciting direct violence, then I actually do think that it's pretty important that we don't jump the gun and start and start kind of treating that as if it is crossing the line, because I actually think that I actually feel like that's like ultimately going to be, for anyone interested in like the radical left or emancipatory, radical anti-institutional politics, anyone who is interested in those sorts of things really need to be as committed as possible to kind of protecting that space of radical free speech, even when there are lots of people out there who would say that it's really close to being unacceptable. So yeah, in this weird way, I actually think the radical right and people like Richard Spencer are kind of baiting the left into being like overly repressive to a degree that is ultimately going to snuff out the very possibilities of like radical emancipatory dialogue and action.
Well, I appreciate that, but I guess my rebuttal would be twofold, right? I mean, that's an argument that my podcast co-host has oftentimes made to me, that in a sense the left needs to preserve speech rights so that the state or various reactionary forces don't use those same bludgeons against the left.
Right.
But I mean, I think my feeling is that, I mean, the left has been a fearsome defender of free speech in the past, and it has literally done nothing to save the left from the forces of reaction. Or at least, I should probably be more careful in my characterization, but it's done very little. And it does strike me as ironic that at this moment where we're talking about, the intolerance of the left, that we literally have Republican state legislatures passing laws that make it okay for motorists to just run down protesters, or where we have legislation that's passing through state houses and even it seems through the U.S. Supreme Court, not legislation but a case that would have the same effect, that severely limiting workers' ability to speak and assemble in collective bargaining units. So I mean, I find, I guess that's my first point, that this whole idea that if we defend free speech for right-wingers, that right-wingers will somehow defend it for us, I think that's just historical bunk. Like, they don't give a shit. They will never defend it for us.
Go on. Sorry.
No, go ahead. And there's another point I wanted to make, but okay. I want to hear what you have to say.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I don't think the rationale is so much that the left needs to defend free speech so that the right will also defend it for the left. I agree with you that that's kind of just implausible. That's not so much how political dialogue over time works. It's more that by sort of enforcing particular speech codes, what happens is that the right actually becomes more resentful and ultimately more violent. I actually do basically think that is kind of one way to read the past decade or two, especially since the 90s, that basically, I mean, the rise of social liberalism has become so ascendant that, for people who aren't really sympathetic to kind of leftist progressive, social norms, they've had to adapt, and things like homosexuality and race and interracial marriage and all these things that even like 30 years ago a fair number of people just were not cool with. All of those people have had to kind of accept them and adjust to them, and in a lot of ways, it's really great, obviously. Like, we live in a much more accepting, tolerant culture nowadays than we did, 30 years ago or so. But I do think a lot about the small number of people who well, no, not even small number of people, really, like, the conservative half of the population that might just for their own temperamental reasons not be as happy with that. My sense is that what's happening now is that kind of the social liberal left is so kind of ascendant in that respect that as it gets more aggressive in kind of controlling what other people are allowed to say in public, those people actually get more and more angry, and you're going to see more, you're more and more likely to see that things like people like Donald Trump get elected. I mean, I really do kind of read the Trump election as a kind of outcome of the kind of leftist culture that's become ascendant in kind of mainstream neoliberal kind of like identity politics. But that's just my view.
No, and I think that there's something there, but I mean, I guess where I would push back is that, I agree, for example, that I think that there's a great deal of right-wing resentment against a perceived culture of political correctness and policing of speech. But I guess I fundamentally question how real I think that phenomenon is. And I also question how strictly limited that is to the left. Right. I mean, the left gets tarred with this all the time, but there's an equally virulent strain of policing amongst conservatives around, sort of patriotic issues and issues pertaining to like troops and first responders. There are certain people who, in right-wing circles, you just simply cannot critique, and whom even liberals are at their peril to liberals or leftists are at their peril to critique too vocally in public settings, right? So I guess I sort of, it's not that the resentment isn't real. It's that I think the thing that they are resentful about is vastly overstated, and that a lot of right-wing media outlets have understood that it's a pathway to power to sort of gin up these resentments, while ignoring the way in which basically everything that's being said about the left could just as easily be said about the right, and yet has not had the same kind of resent generating effects as what we've seen on the right. Well,
maybe. I mean, that's interesting. I guess that's kind of an open, debatable, empirical question, because my sense is that the sort of history of the past few decades is basically one in which all of the domains in which conservatives tried to exert social control for moralistic reasons, they basically lost, and kind of the floodgates of liberal, progressive, multicultural kind of tolerance and diversity basically came crashing down on them, and they completely lost that. So, I have in mind, of course, things like, everything from like desegregation to homosexuality up to gay marriage and to legalization of marijuana, all of these things. These are floodgates that like moralistic, controlling conservatives tried to stop and were quite passionate about trying to stop. But now, after those floodgates have completely demolished kind of the conservative ability for moral control, I actually do think that now the dominant kind of attitude among those moralistic conservatives is, okay, well, those battles are, they might be pissed off about it internally, they might have their own arguments, they might be resentful or whatever, but more or less their attitude is, well, they're going to do their thing. That's already all out of control. So at least let us live in peace, and let us have our norms, and let us have our opinions. And at the very least, we've let all of you social liberals do all of these things that we were opposed to. But now, at the very least, we're going to be allowed to say what we want to say. And if you start coming for that, then that's when they're going to get that's like where they're going to draw the line. And I think you see that with Trump. I mean, one of the main sort of things that Trump ran on, not so much explicitly, although even somewhat explicitly, he did actually, mention, political correctness and things like that at various points. But I really do think that his, the particular unique identity or ethos of someone like Donald Trump really, it really, I think, shows that what people wanted was not just the kind of like populist outsider, but specifically someone to smash down sort of this like system of, what is perceived as kind of left liberal linguistic codes that
Right.
that lots of conservative people feel like not only are they kind of left out of and excluded from, but like they feel like they've kind of tolerated so many things they don't like from people that, when is their turn to just simply be able to say what it is they want to say without,
Right.
being called like genocidal for saying that. And so that's why when I see, campus activists or whoever it might be, saying someone like Richard Spencer should not be allowed to speak anywhere because he's genocidal, even though he's very carefully, not calling for violence in any kind of particularly explicit way. That's when I'm sort of like, okay, this is exactly what got us Trump, and we're not learning from it. We're actually, people on the left are doubling down on it, and I fear that that's going to be this like right versus left kind of dialectic is going to be like the engine that's going to make American politics increasingly worse and worse, precisely along the lines that Trump represents.
That's interesting, and I mean, there are elements of that I find kind of compelling, but I also sort of see this as, and I know you don't identify as liberal, nor do I, but I see this as that kind of argument in some ways is kind of typical with the liberal tendency to like negotiate with yourself before actually making demands. I mean, like what's the parallel of this? Desegregation really pissed off conservatives too. I mean, are we gonna go back in time and undo desegregation because it caused massive resistance? It's like when you are taking power, whatever your goal may be in taking power, right? Like you're going to piss people off. And I think this sort of, well, how do we make people feel like they haven't lost when in fact they have lost? That strikes me as the same kind of mentality in some respects as sort of like Democrats in 2009, 2010 trying to make the ACA more palatable to Republicans when they knew damn well the Republicans were never going to like it, period. I don't know. I just, I think that you're onto something in the sense that yes, it's causing resentment, but I also don't know, short of just giving up, I don't know what we can do that will not cause resentment. And I guess there's a couple other things that I wanted to add. And the first one is that I think that yes, there is some danger. I mean, I recognize. I think you're absolutely right. There is some danger inherent in some degree of the policing that goes on in left circles. Even if I think that that policing is overstated, and even if I think that that policing is far outstripped by what's happening both legally and culturally on the right. But I also think that as the left is trying to grapple with the diversity of the United States in the 21st century, there are real dangers in not representing constituencies who feel directly threatened by folks like Richard Spencer, right? So like in Gainesville, for a lot of socialist organizations, we're already operating in this environment where a lot of activists of colors tend to think of socialism as this like white male movement, kind of all the slurs about the Bernie bros and things like that. And so I think it was really essential for us to be in solidarity with communities of color, activists of color, because, if we are going to build a socialism, both locally, nationally, and internationally, that is capable of affecting real change, I mean, we have to have, communities who are not just, white men on board. And I think that beyond our own theoretical critique of the situation, there is also a pragmatic component, because I'm a member of Socialist Alternative, which is a member of the CWI. I forget exactly what our sister organization is called in Britain, but we have parties throughout the world. I think that our take in Socialist Alternative was that it was really important to be there for activists of color. That our future in Gainesville and in North Central Florida more broadly demands that at this like critical moment that we don't sort of fall back on theoretical conversations about the importance of free speech, but instead put ourselves on the line and join in solidarity with folks who are trying to get Spencer out of the community. So that was I think a lot of what our reasoning was around that event.
Yeah, I feel that. Tell me a little bit more about your organization, or more broadly, kind of what is your? I'm curious, like what is your sense of the end game that you're interested in? How do you see kind of radical politics playing out ideally in your kind of vision or politics?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, and I'm probably going to give a somewhat mealy-mouthed answer, and I would also be really interested in your answer to this. Yeah. And it's partially because, like, on the one hand, as an activist, I have one set of outcomes that I would very much like to see, and then as somebody who's trained at least professionally as a historian, I have a different, if not set of desired outcomes, certainly a different set of expected outcomes. So I guess as an activist, the Socialist Alternative and the CWI, it's a Trotskyist organization. We sort of subscribe to the transitional program. So the kind of motivating ideology of the party, both locally and internationally, is sort of long-term revolutionary outlook, but a belief that part of the pathway to revolutionary outcomes involves a degree of parliamentarism and also a degree of reformism in the short run. But like not reformism for its own sake, but reformism as something that enables revolutionary change in the longer term. Right? So we don't think about, universal health care just as something that is a human right, something that people deserve because they're human beings, and something that we should provide because we live in a rich society that's capable of delivering these services, but also because, we argue that if folks aren't constantly worrying about their health, they can actually engage in more activism and take greater risks in their communities and in larger society. So that's sort of the position of SA as an organization. Ideally, I would love, I tend to, I think, skew far closer to pacifism than maybe some socialists do. Okay. I certainly, envision revolutionary change. I think that revolutionary change not only can be accomplished, but is in fact most likely to succeed through revolutionary nonviolent direct action rather than armed insurrection. But I would, broadly speaking, identify as a revolutionary socialist, even if I personally am more convinced of the prospects of nonviolent direct action. But so that's sort of like my theoretical take, my take as an activist. But I guess as a historian, I'm always skeptical about how effectively socialists can organize in the U.S. Like, is the U.S. just hopelessly mired in capitalist ideology? I don't know. And so I think at very least, like my more realistic outcome is that there needs to be a powerful and viable left, even if that left is not capable of taking power, that we at least need to be strong enough to make the Democratic Party less terrible than it is. So yeah, that's my historian's take. Like when I'm feeling more cynical, that we probably won't take power, but at least we'll succeed in making the center left party some semblance of like a working people's party. And my activist take is let's organize and change things like fundamentally. Yeah.
Okay. I hear you. Definitely. A lot of that sounds pretty good to me. So were you into, I guess you were well into Bernie Sanders?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of my, I was a very lazy activist prior to Trump's election. I would talk a lot with people, and I would write, and I sort of saw my teaching as an element of activism, even though I was, careful not to like just out and out, preach from the lectern or whatever. But I support Bernie. I voted for Bernie in the primary. But I ultimately wound up campaigning for Clinton during the 2016 election. I mean, okay. I didn't do so particularly enthusiastically.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I would have, if I had it to do over again, if I would do it now. But I'm married to an immigrant, and so a lot of these issues around immigration, I mean, they strike really close to home. And while I believe at sort of a theoretical level that at some point we do fundamentally, as a left, need to make a break with the Democratic Party in the U.S. And organize a real working class party, I also recognize that, in the short run, that's probably going to hurt some people and, allow like shitheads like Trump to take power and use ICE in ways that were even more harmful than what, for example, the Obama administration was doing.
Right. Yeah, I hear you. Well, I mean, I can tell you a little bit about what I think. I guess it's in many ways extremely different, I think, than kind of the model that you're operating on. But to be honest, I mean, I don't really have it figured out. I would say that actually in the moment I'm in a pretty profound kind of reorienting stage, I think. So what I have right now at the moment is, in my mind, as far as my own kind of political perspective goes, is really just a set of coordinates, I think, like a few big points that I've become really interested in, and also just kind of I've become really convinced that they're essential, and I'm basically trying to integrate them or update them. I mean, so for years, I mean, basically from Occupy Wall Street until really almost like last year, honestly, I was kind of I had a similar perspective as yours. I was a little bit more kind of on the anarcho-communist kind of insurrectionary kind of angle.
Right.
And a lot of that comes through Occupy. I kind of got radicalized in Occupy, and I kind of,
right.
Yeah. So that kind of gives you a touchstone for kind of the style of politics that I guess I got, kind of very interested in there. But after that, I kind of got more into activism and traditional organizing. I met a lot of organizers and traditional activists through Occupy and kind of came to respect it more and kind of got socialized into it. And yeah, so I was like a pretty, standard, good, noble kind of leftist activist organizer. And I was that for a while. And even when I came to the UK, I kind of joined organizations here, was a member of anti-fascist groups here, did a bunch of demonstrations. I was a member of a group called Plan C, which is a pretty cool, like, revolutionary anti-capitalist group in the UK. They're kind of independent, but they're really cool. And, I was, quite at home with them for a while. Anyway, so that was like for several years. But really, it was only about last year that I got really interested in these topics, actually, that we were just talking about for the past, half hour or so about things like speech and how we choose to speak to each other or don't speak to each other, and like what people are allowed to say or think in activist meetings. Like, I became very interested in how honestly, not even just the problems of activist culture, but just really group psychology. I became very attuned to the myriad ways in which all groups tend to have certain kind of self-deceiving tendencies, and that's just kind of how groups maintain themselves in some sense.
Right.
And so I became very interested in that sort of stuff, and I just became very I was increasingly convinced that those problems are actually at the base of why the radical left does not kind of expand in healthy, radical, emancipatory ways that tend to threaten kind of the larger status quo. I became increasingly convinced, or I was increasingly seeing the ways in which, again, it's not even like a big kind of like righteous, critique of political correctness or anything like that. It was more basic group psychology kinds of stuff. And so because I was increasingly seeing those things and becoming interested in those things, I started exploring them more, and I was even surprised by how many minor things actually got me in a lot of trouble among my friends. Like, there were certain things, like, you're really just not allowed to really even like read about or like talk, there's certain types of books that if you like have in your, stack of books from the library, like you're seen as like not a good leftist or something like that. And and so I became increasingly, I started to notice those things more and more, just because I was getting intrigued in different types of topics or whatever. And so, yeah, without getting, I could tell you the whole story and talk your ear off for hours, and maybe one day you'd want to hear about all that. But honestly, you could piece it together if you looked through my
Absolutely.
archive or whatever. So I won't go over it all now. But basically, that's the long and short of it. And so ultimately, I kind of came to the view that activism, as we know it, I just cannot personally believe in activism as we know it.
Okay.
And I say that with some reservations because, and I choose my words wisely because I don't want to tell anyone not to do it. I really don't.
Right.
I really don't. And I don't want to attack it, and I don't want to be cynical and poo-poo people. I mean, I like, one of my favorite philosophers is Gilles Deleuze, and one of the famous, things that he has said, he's got a lot of brilliant one-liners, but one of the things he says is, there's really no reason to object to anything. If you don't like something, just ignore it. If you like it, then you participate in it. And if you can't connect with it, then, there's no need to poo-poo it. There's no need to, object. Just look the other way and look for new weapons in a direction that you want to move in.
Right.
And I'm extremely sympathetic to that. So I have lots of friends on the activist left, and, I want them to succeed. I would love to see, the grassroots, social democratic movements make the world a better place for everyone and more equal for everyone. I would love to see that. So I don't want to tell people not to do that, but I've come to think personally that how should I put this? My sense was increasingly that when I went to activist meetings, all I could really see or feel was that it was kind of a theater.
Right.
And one of the ways that came through for me is because I'm a social scientist, so I think very analytically about causes and effects. And one of my attitudes that I have always brought to radical politics is I want to use the absolute strongest tools we have in the most sophisticated ways possible to really kind of reverse engineer how the status quo hangs together, and to really rigorously and radically apply ourselves to unwiring the status quo and creating emancipatory dynamics in the most sophisticated way possible. And so I think, like a scientist, I want to make hypotheses and I want to test it against data. And if you can't convince me that something is going to have the hypothesized effect that it's going to have, then I call bullshit. And so obviously, I mean, I'm not like an elitist, or I don't look down on people who don't think like that or anything like that. So it's not like I need all of my activist comrades to think like that or want to do that. It was more, Sean, just that very interest of mine, that way that I saw it was prohibited. And it's whenever I wanted to kind of push things in that direction or be more challenging and really kind of ask people, okay, but let's break this down. Is any of this campaign that we're doing, is any of it going to, in any plausible way, lead to the revolutionary kind of dynamics or outcomes that we want? Can anyone make me a convincing argument that any of these effects are going to be brought about from the things that we're trying to put into action? And at the very, very best, all I would hear is, crickets. But often, typically, a lot of people would, you start getting dirty looks, and people think that you're attacking them, and you start getting a bad reputation. And so basically I came to the viewpoint that, while I support, people who are trying to fight for a better society, the personal position I came to was that what we really don't have enough of right now today is radical folks trying their honest best to figure out how things work. And I feel like, as a social scientist and as, someone who invested a lot of time and energy in developing a certain kind of expertise or a certain kind of sophistication and understanding how to make inferences about the world from limited data, I kind of came to the personal perspective that was actually the most powerful and dangerous kind of thing that I had. And so long as activism was a big, massive kind of break on it, one, that said to me that, okay, there's something deeply wrong with activism if it's not interested in figuring these things out, at least being open to figuring these things out. One, so I got to get out of here because this is just a toxic environment, I think, for me anyway. And two, that I actually think I can be of more use to the revolutionary movements, if you will, simply carving out the space I need for myself to think and write and speak as radically incisive and honest and analytically powerful as I'm able to. And if that means I can't be part of a group or like a named labeled movement, then I'll take the isolation and radical personal creativity any day of the week. And that's kind of what I came to. Yeah. So sorry, that was a bit of a speech, but that's how I would tell kind of how I see my own politics over the past year or so.
No, and I mean, there's probably about a solid 75% of that I, if not outright agree with, certainly sympathize with.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think that in so many ways the machinery of activism is just broken. Like we're trying the same strategies again and again and again,
right? And
they fail to produce even modestly emancipatory outcomes, and yet we keep doing them. So I mean, I think there. I mean, I think that there's oftentimes a sort of failure of imagination around activism, I guess. And I also do think that there's a certain degree of groupthink in activist circles. I guess I tend to be relatively forgiving of some of these failures because I see them as kind of endemic of every institution of which I've been a part. I mean, the historical profession is like, moribund and committed to reproducing the same ideas, even though those ideas and those practices don't produce the desired outcome. And I feel like universities as a whole kind of do the same thing. I mean, they're in this rut. I mean, maybe it's just that I'm attracted to like these failing institutions that don't have any vitality left in them. Maybe that says something like deep and terrible about me. But yeah, I mean, I do think that dimension of activism is certainly spot on, as at least as far as I've seen. But I guess I question how unique it is. But I think a larger point, and this was actually something I wanted to talk about earlier, and it speaks to your critique of outrage culture, which I think, besides our conversation around Catholic anti-capitalism, was one of the first ways in which I became aware of you as an internet presence.
Oh, right.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like beyond sort of when we're talking about speech issues, and this will hopefully tie back into what you're saying about activism.
Yeah.
That when we're talking about speech issues, we sometimes need to more carefully separate the substance of the critique versus the style in which it's rendered. And I do think that one of the casualties of the internet age, and this has begun to bleed over into real life settings, is just like the unpleasantness of virtually all interactions, and the ease and eagerness with which people resort to like really extreme positions. And I mean, I say this like I'm not, I'm certainly not critical of radicalism in virtually any aspect of life. That's not really what I'm talking about. I guess what I'm talking about is just like people getting really mad really, really quickly, oftentimes about really small things.
Yeah.
And, like to go back to the example that I mentioned earlier, where I was talking about activists of color really aggressively calling out, sort of clueless white liberals. One of the, I kind of feel like where the conversation broke down, and this is going to come dangerously close to tone policing. So I beg forbearance on the part of like both you and anybody listening. But I mean, I think that where so many of these conversations break down is that like things just get really heated really quickly, and there's no opportunity for actual dialogue where people grow. I think that there's a certain sense that like people need to enter leftist politics with a degree of purity already in hand. And I mean, this is kind of a two-way street, right? Because I think that on the one hand, we have like a lot of activists who have been answering the same questions over and over and over and over and over again, and are tired of giving the same answer. And I totally respect that. I get that. But on the other hand, we also have sort of folks who are new, who are oftentimes extremely fragile, and who are unwilling to hear the critique itself. And this is just kind of a toxic recipe for meaningful conversations that allow people to grow. And it's not that I don't understand where people are coming from in these in-person settings, but I think that oftentimes people have less patience in person because we're already all so immersed in this horrifically toxic online sphere of activism where people are just like constantly being terrible to one another. And it might sound sort of like Pollyanna-ish to suggest that if we were just nicer to each other, that some of these problems could be eradicated. But I really do think that some of this is just like, there's a pervasive shittiness to life online that to an extent has bled over into in-person activist settings that is compromising our ability to do good work.
Yeah, well, I think that's well put. That's for sure. I mean, I wonder what you would think about this, because I've kind of always had this hypothesis, and I've never really been able to sell it in like the activist left. But it really goes back to what we were talking about before when we were talking about free speech and related issues. I actually really think that of all sort of groups or organizations or subcultures that could most benefit from a kind of shared ethics of radical free speech, even I just mean within organizations, like within interpersonal relationships, even it's actually the radical left. And that I sometimes think if there was one possible panacea or just one specific kind of intervention that could possibly be most radically effective for kind of rejuvenating the kind of health and energy and kind of power even of like radical left groups, it would be adopting a simple policy of radical free speech. And I'm not talking about like the politics of, external speakers and that whole can of worms like we were talking about with like Richard Spencer coming to campus. Sure. I'm saying put all of that aside. I mean, for people that like you have, a basic minimum amount of, trust and experience with, like your comrades in your groups or whatever. For those people, there should be, I think, a basic norm of radical free speech in that basically, if it's on the level of saying words, nothing that bad can happen to you, and nothing that bad, it can't be taken that seriously. But more importantly, I think like what it really comes down to is the principle of charity, which is, the idea that you assume that the person you're talking with is trying to say something that is true and good and valuable. And if it hurts your feelings, or if it seems offensive, or if it seems really wrong, or even if it seems, evil in some way, you actually, the first stage is you assume that's because you don't understand something. And that surely this person is trying to get at something good and true, but it's just very strange and alien to you, and you feel threatened, and that's fine. But it's just language, and I think that if activist groups could actually practice, like if you could wave a magic wand, like give me two activist groups, like one activist group A has 25 people, activist group B has 25 people, and they're more or less equal in like most of their average dimensions, and you could just wave a magic wand, and one of them starts operating on just a basic ethics of radical free speech and the principle of charity. I really do think that it's empirically and social scientifically reasonable to imagine how that group would rapidly start to grow in power, because what would happen is, well, one, the creativity would skyrocket. People would be able to propose a far wider variety of ideas, and simply by increasing, the options that get circulated, that's going to be a massive boon. But you're also going to see things like trust and relaxation and all of these kinds of kind of intangible psychosociological resources would really start being brewed up like crazy, and kind of multiplied. And I actually really do think that that's one possible specific kind of intervention or reform, if you will, that people could actually start applying within their own groups that really speaks to actual emancipatory dynamics that potentially could start spreading throughout society. And so whether you agree or not, or whether you agree or disagree with that, you know, feel free to say. But this also at least gives you some understanding of why I had kind of had to make my break with the organized activist left, because I was increasingly coming to that viewpoint that radical free speech is actually precisely what we need the most.
Yeah, I guess I'm. To me, what I feel is lacking oftentimes is not so much the willingness to encounter hostile speech, but rather the charity. Yeah, I mean, I guess like I would put more emphasis on the charity than the radical free speech.
Yeah.
Because I mean, at least in the activist circles where I'm involved, I mean, I don't. It's not that the big obstacle is not that. I don't know if there's an easy or meaningful way to disentangle them, but right, it's that willingness to believe that that people are operating from a place of good intentions, and that they're oftentimes just having difficulty expressing themselves in the most optimal way, right? I mean, I oftentimes think about this, you know, like. Obviously, I'm not a TED Talk talker. I don't know what you call somebody who does TED Talks for a living, right? Or like a schmuck. There we go. Yeah, or like a motivational speaker. But you know, in a certain sense, right? Like I do get paid to talk for a living,
right?
And I'm still constantly struck by how many times I just do not have the right words to express. What I'm actually trying to get at. And I think by its very nature, when you are in settings that are supposed to be revolutionary, you should be trying to articulate ideas that don't form themselves readily.
Exactly.
I'm like, I remember in grad school thinking, I'm like reading a bunch of post-structuralist theorists and thinking like what terrible writers they were. And to a certain extent, like, that is true, but I also think the position I ultimately reached was that, in the years since Judith Butler has published Gender Trouble, we have come up with simpler ways of expressing the ideas that she was getting at in there. But when she was getting at them, they were still, for the most part, genuinely new ideas, and so we need to cut theorists some slack because they're getting at something that people have not gotten at before. And I think something similar happens ideally in activist situations where people are grappling with ideas that are new to them, where they don't have a sort of entrenched vocabulary or set of catchphrases to express their views. And, you know, they're going to mess up sometimes. And we should be, as much as possible, charitable, because, you know, we don't have enough people on our side to go around alienating folks.
Yeah, for sure. Do you want to... Is there anything that you had on your mind coming into this conversation that you wanted? I don't want to kind of pigeonhole the conversation into these sorts of culture war topics. If unless you're keen, I could talk about whatever, really.
Yeah, no, I mean, I didn't have anything in particular in mind, so I was just going to go with the flow.
Did you know that we're both from New Jersey?
I did not know that. What part of Jersey are you from?
I only saw on your website this morning when I was going over your stuff one last time that I'm from Ocean Township, New Jersey. In Monmouth County. I saw you're from Trenton, right?
Yeah. I mean, I'm actually from the bordering town, but Trenton barely registers on most people's mental or geographical or quite literal maps, and so I'm not going to burden anybody with the name of my actual town.
You know, maybe I'd like to pick your brain a little bit about academia and you kind of. Yeah, I don't know, your perspective on a few things, because academia is actually one of the things I'm thinking about a lot lately, even just in a personal capacity. I mean, as I've done more and more blogging and podcasting and this sort of just totally independent, intellectual work, really.
Right.
To be honest with you, I love it so much. Like, it's so much more fun and satisfying to work out my ideas by turning on the microphone or sitting down to do a blog post or whatever. And the juxtaposition or the contrast actually is so great, and I feel like it's becoming greater and greater, that it's almost starting to be a kind of problem for me. Like it's starting to become it's starting to feel like a kind of, I don't know how to describe it. Like I feel like I was relatively content with academia. I mean, I definitely had my gripes with it, and I think I've always had my gripes with academia. But the more I do independent intellectual work on the internet, the more unbearable the bullshit and the tedium of academic responsibilities become. And,
yeah, right.
And to a point where like I'm really kind of schizophrenic and having a hard time processing it and making like reasonable kind of diagnoses of what to do next or how to prioritize things. And so I'm just curious, because you do a podcast and you do a lot of, public writing and stuff like that. I'm just, I almost want to appeal to you for, I'm just curious if anything I just said, if you've ever had, feelings like that. And if so, and if so, like how you process that, that kind of conflict or tension, if you've ever felt it. And if not, forget it.
Oh yeah, I totally feel that tension. Yeah, and I suppose it's a bit different. I mean, I've been I'm a trailing spouse. My partner got a job at the University of Florida a little over 3 years ago, or a little under 3 years ago, whatever. And so, I mean, for the past 2 years and change, 3 years, I'm losing track of time. Since the summer of 2015, I've been a long-term adjunct, and I've been grinding out every course that I can get my hands on.
Okay.
And obviously that's not a professional situation that's conducive to like making you reflect positively upon academia.
Right.
So from like just a personal perspective, I mean, my institutional opinion of academia was never that high, and being treated basically like a disposable piece of trash in the machinery of academia is not, it doesn't make you like academia anymore. So yeah, I mean, I sympathize with that element. But yeah, I guess ever since I started doing the public facing stuff, ever since I started writing for the public or doing podcasting, it just seems so much more interesting than the scholarship. Or I guess I don't want to put them in opposition. It's a more interesting way of doing the scholarship. I don't
Right.
see what I'm doing on the podcast or in my here and there career as a journalist as at odds with my training as a historian. I just kind of see it as like a different way to fulfill that training. It's really hard to like convince myself that I should actually go write a scholarly article. But fortunately, I mean, I guess the one thing I can say that's positive about adjuncting is that all of the institutional imperatives, all the reasons or incentives rather for producing traditional scholarly research, like they don't exist. I mean, I have literally no reason to go to conferences or to crank out scholarly articles because it will make no difference in my career as an adjunct.
Right.
So, I mean, I guess that's kind of part of it. I've largely given up on it because it didn't really satisfy me that much in the first place, and it now serves no professional purpose. I mean, but how are you working through this sort of like pull towards more public-facing aspects of scholarship?
Well, it's a really good question, and I have no clue. I'm trying to navigate it, but all I know really is that the more I do blogging and podcasting, what's happening is, to be honest, I mean, I'm kind of hoping no one I work with is listening to this, because I mean, I actually really like everyone I work with. I don't have a single bad thing to say about the people I work with.
Right.
But I'm a little nervous about outing myself in terms of how my attitudes and enthusiasms are changing. But
Sure.
But I actually feel like I'm finding it increasingly difficult to like even tolerate. I have a permanent position. I'm basically the British version of tenured already. It's a much less
right.
kind of significant type of tenure, but I basically already passed my probation, is what it's called here, and so I'm permanent, and I could basically have this job in British academia probably forever, unless I were to really screw something up really bad somehow. And so it's a little different than what you're describing, because I am incentivized to do research, and if I do lots of good publications, people will respect me and think I'm cool and give me more money and that kind of stuff.
Right.
So the incentives are there, and it's certainly a relatively secure position. In other words, like I kind of won the lottery in academic terms. I did have to move to the UK, which is something a lot of Americans, I think, would not do. But yeah, and I made out pretty well, and I kind of got the tenure track job, and then now I'm basically the British version of tenure. And so my problem is just that I find it very boring, to be honest.
Yeah.
The truth is, I mean, I've become a little bit more interested lately in personality psychology and kind of the science of personality, and I've been reading a lot about that. And I actually think it's extremely useful for understanding just the ways in which people are different. Like people do have different traits, and people have different strengths and weaknesses. And what I'm realizing, I think, through this, and really it is through my kind of increasing just effort in kind of creative, intellectual, totally autonomous intellectual work that I just do because I want to do it, and I share it with people online. I'm not like at all like famous or anything. I just have like a very small number of people who do read my stuff, though. I have just enough people that it's like it feels worthwhile and it's motivating to produce stuff. But I probably have like the bare minimum of that quantity to make it feel like that, So not boasting at all. I mean, I have no real influence or anything. But just having that has brought out a certain experience of some of my traits that is just like it's really hard to deny. And then in contrast to that, doing the kind of oh, Sean, are you there?
I am, yeah.
Oh, I heard the Skype bubble kind of. Oh, I wasn't sure if I lost you. No worries. I think we're fine. Yeah. So basically, just doing this sort of stuff on the internet. I'm like, put it this way. I'll give you an example to be concrete. I feel like I'm being a little abstract. Like when I get an idea for a blog post and I'm really into the idea, I can easily drop everything I'm doing and write that blog post for like an 8-hour period. Without even, walking away for a drink, and feel totally happy and excited. And then I can be done with that 8 hours of work and feel proud, happy, interested, satisfied, and like, at the top of my game. And to be honest with you, almost nothing in academia ever gives me that feeling. And even the scholarly work that I'm most interested in, and like when I'm doing good scholarly work that I'm interested in, and I'm kind of at the height of my powers, and I feel like I'm doing good work, I definitely, it comes kind of close, but even that, it's such, it's so much more taxing, and it's ultimately more alienated for the obvious reason that, the drill, you have to kind of like fit everything you're thinking into this like highly narrow, predefined kind of catechism of the previous literature, whether you have any interest in that literature at all or not. And it's like, so all academia really is, as you know, is, it's like taking your intellectual enthusiasm and capacity, and then it's like, it's literally torturing the shit out of it for the sole purpose. Well, literally for the sole purpose of making it harder for most people to read, and of making it of interest to like the smallest possible audience. And it's like, I think that it's fine. Like, I think there's a certain personality type, or there's certain personality traits that like a secure academic job is perfectly good. Like lots of people can do that, for all their life, and I'm not even shitting on it. That's cool. Lots of good, interesting intellectual value can come out of that. I think the thing is that the whole reason we have that kind of system is obviously it's a kind of historical heritage of a media environment, or an information communication environment that was radically different than the one that we have today. And so I think it's just, it's so obvious now that all of those kinds of, all of those frictions, all of those kinds of institutional, alienating, filters that you have to painfully, tortuously, kind of filter your intellectual capacities through, it's increasingly obvious that they don't need to exist anymore. And once you get a little bit of a taste of like doing all of the stuff that you're doing online, for me anyway, personally, I think for some people, the idea of like doing creative work online and podcasting all the time and making YouTube videos, for some people, that sounds horrible because people are different. We do have different personality traits. I think significantly more extroverted than the average academic, specifically on the aspect of enthusiasm. It's like 1/2 of extroversion, and you know, I think when you're really high on enthusiasm, you want to have projects that you're super interested in, and you can just sort of cut loose and go super hard on that thing that you're really interested in, and you can work way harder than most people and feel really happy and energetic about it for really long periods of time. You can get a lot of mileage out of that, and you can do it live on the internet and these sorts of things. I'm actually really well suited to that. It's consistent with my strengths, okay? And I think for a lot of academics, it's not, and that's perfectly fine. So they don't have to do it. But this is basically a long kind of rambling way of me trying to explain to you that I'm starting to realize a lot of these things, and I'm starting to realize that a lot of my strengths kind of point away from academia, and actually a lot of I actually have a lot of weaknesses that don't really do too well in academia. Namely, like having to do large volumes of like tedious, kind of bureaucratic stuff. Like I really find that kind of stuff like increasingly painful, and so it's leading to this like really increasingly sharp sort of feeling of being torn between my different like intellectual projects.
Yeah, it's so cool what you said about torturing your ideas to fit in to the framework of the existing scholarship.
Yeah.
I was teaching this really, really well received piece of early American Republic historical scholarship on working people in Baltimore, and it's a great book. It's a genuinely awesome book. From I don't know, probably like 2008, 2009. When I was in grad school, it was like the book. You know, like every seminar that I went into, if it had anything even remotely to do with the early American Republic, like this book would be on the list. And so I was teaching portions of it to one of my classes. It was like a senior seminar the other day, and these are kids who, for the most part, like they know American history pretty well. They know the conventions of historical scholarship, and yet when it came time to get to this book, they just didn't care about the conclusions of this monograph. And for a long time, I thought like, oh, maybe it's just because it's the week before spring break, or maybe they're just tired, or maybe, you know, this is just the weird alchemy of this classroom. But then when a couple of my students made some comments, and then I began re-examining the book as a whole. And what I realized was that if you weren't neck deep in some really minute historiographical conversations, virtually none of these conclusions would mean anything to you, right? So like basically you had to have a historiographically grounded misconception in order for this book to allow you to reconceive notions around who constituted the early American working class or what have you, right? And just this reminder that so much of the work we do in academia, we're like literally making our ideas less interesting to the world at large in order to genuflect to our own scholarly paths or the paths of our disciplines.
Right.
To the point where we're putting 15 people ahead of the interests of literally billions of people in a broader public who could potentially benefit from some of these conclusions. Right. I've become increasingly frustrated with that, and I think forgive me if this is not the word that you would describe for yourself or use to describe yourself, but like I feel like I'm a bit of an intellectual dilettante. When I need to focus on a single topic, I can do it. I wrote a dissertation and all, but I do genuinely get bored in my area of specialization, and so one of the great things about podcasting, about writing for the public, and other kinds of activities is that it allows you to kind of embrace that dilettantism and dance around different bodies of scholarship.
Right.
And I think there's a genuine place for that in if not in academia, certainly in the world of scholarship, if we can make a distinction between the two, right? Like we need folks who are capable of surveying a bunch of weird literatures and a bunch of weird topics and trying to draw conclusions between them, just as much, if not more, than we need people to be extremely well versed in some very minute area. Yeah, so I share your skepticism about whether academia can provide a particularly fulfilling life for folks who are interested in I don't know, like, you know, sort of jumping around between topics and trying to engage like people outside of academia where they are. Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. I get that.
Yeah. No, and I could understand for sure why you would identify as a dilettante, and I think there's nothing wrong with that. I definitely know what you mean, and I'm sure I'm similar in that respect. But, you know, honestly, though, I also think about it almost as if sometimes I feel like the real dilettantes are the disciplined, respectable academics. Because no, and you know why? Because the truth is, you know, most of their time is spent doing non-intellectual bullshit. You know, like, right. If they're disciplined and conscientious and productive, then sure, they'll go home every night and put in several hours working on their research. You know, maybe before work in the morning, in the early morning, and then at night also. But it doesn't change the fact that, you know, their everyday's work is mostly preoccupied with all kinds of things like meetings, marking, teaching, emailing, paperwork, all kinds of things, right? So it's like, the truth is, like, the respectable kind of professional career academic is actually only doing research as a relatively small portion of all of the things that they do. Like, they're the ones who are only, they're the ones who are kind of only dabbling in the intellectual life, to be honest. My kind of interest and enthusiasm for blogging and podcasting and all these sorts of new, wide open fora for creative intellectual production, it's actually not the drive of the dilettante, I think, or at least maybe it currently is by definition, because maybe anyone who does intellectual work on the internet is merely a dilettante. You might be right, but I think the dilettantism is actually trying to birth something much larger. Or I have an ever so slight and hazy vision of something much grander and much larger. Not that I'm going to do it single-handedly or something like that. I don't have any delusions of grandeur, but I feel like the reason I'm so into it and excited by it and kind of, I can't get my mind off it, and it's hard to go back to academic work is because what I actually see at the end of the tunnel is that creative intellectuals who are able to use these new fora seriously might actually be able to become an all new kind of even more seriously dedicated and focused and specialized and impactful sort of real intellectual, where like basically what I'm getting at in a more concrete sense is when I do my blogging and podcasting and stuff like that, when I was telling you before, when I just kind of piss a day away, like writing a blog post and doing nothing else, but just getting super into it. What that actually gives me a sense of, or a taste for, or a vision of is, why can I not just do this every single day? Do you know what I mean? And in some sense, that's the opposite of dilettantism. What I'm really going for, what I really want, is a truly and deeply kind of committed, specialized, focused intellectual life. And so I actually think that in some ways, global capitalism and contemporary work regiments kind of impose dilettantism on everyone as a kind of condition of life today, and academics as much as anyone. And I actually think that if there's a path for like a serious new type of intellectual to emerge from these sorts of like ashes of the old intellectual, it would be through some way figuring out how to be purely on the internet. Like that's what that's honestly what I can't stop thinking about. And that's why, I mean, I don't have any answers. I don't know how to do it. And I have a lot of, anxiety and uncertainty about how to how to kind of keep trying to move towards that. But that's kind of why I raised it, because I'm interested in hearing from people like you and, anyone who's thinking about it and these sorts of things, for like how you see these coordinates and how to play them, because I don't know, but I all I know is kind of what I want, or what I'm trying to work towards.
Yeah. And I'm totally there with you on this idea that, ideally there is a sort of new way of being an intellectual at the end of all this. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I do feel like, we have kind of reached the end of the lifetime of this mode of scholarly production that kind of begins in the late 19th century with the professionalization of the university, and seems to have ended, or is being in the process of ending right now. What exactly it will look like, I don't know. I mean, I think I'm a little less optimistic about the role of the internet in this, just because I kind of see internet culture as, if not intrinsically toxic, it's certainly so soaked in toxins that it's kind of hard to see it as anything else.
For sure.
But I mean, I do think there's something really cool about the fact that, like, you're a political scientist, I'm a historian, who also teaches writing. And we didn't have to do a conference. We didn't have to put together a proposal. We just decided to have a conversation.
Right.
And your podcast, I think, is a great example of this, where you're talking to people from all these different backgrounds, both within and outside of academia, in the hopes that it fosters some kind of broader, understanding or vision of intellectual life. Yeah. I mean, I'm optimistic about it, even if I don't necessarily think that the internet will play quite so central role.
One thing I was curious to ask you about is, would you like to tell us about your book? I saw that you're working on a book about
it's a work very much in progress. I mean, I've been teaching 5 classes a semester with a bunch of activists and other service obligations on top of that. So sure. Yeah. I haven't had a whole lot of time for writing in recent years, but it's basically it's a history of the 19th century beard movement, that the sort of period from roughly 1850 to 1900, when seemingly every man in the so-called Western world decided that it was just a great idea to grow an enormous beard.
Oh, is that right? So when you say movement, do you mean it had a kind of conscious kind of sense of itself in that way, or was it just a fashion?
Yeah, no, I actually think that it had a sense of itself, not in the same way that we would talk about, the labor movement or the civil rights movement or something like that. But people were writing these very earnest editorials about why men should grow beards. There's a surprising amount of newspaper space in the 19th century that's given over to the virtues of beard wearing. So in that sense, yeah, I mean, people are strenuously arguing on behalf of this fashion.
Okay.
To the point where it does seem like it has some broad characteristics of a social movement.
That's pretty cool. How did you get into that?
It was kind of an indirect trajectory. I don't have a beard. I'm not actually that interested in facial hair in sort of an intrinsic sense. But I was reading this street peddler who in the 1840s became inexplicably famous, just ridiculously famous. I think that he had more newspaper mentions in the late 1840s than Charles Dickens and P.T. Barnum combined. Okay. He went by the name of the Razor Strop Man, and he sold razor strops, and he was a temperance speaker. And so I got kind of interested in this guy, and more particularly in trying to figure out why people liked him so much. And my advisor suggested to me in the course of this research that I should consider the history of grooming, right? That maybe that would help explain why this guy selling a grooming tool became so famous. And it turned out to be a really fruitful line of inquiry. It turns out that it seemed like there are all these transformations in the labor of grooming that are going on during this time period, and with the physical embodied experience of grooming during this time period that seem to have resulted first in making shaving far more uncomfortable for a lot of particularly white men in Western Europe and North America, and which ultimately seems to have resulted in them deciding that they wanted to grow beards to like escape the horror of having to shave themselves every morning.
Fascinating. Yeah. So do you think that's going to become like it's a scholarly book, right? But do you think maybe it will be become like a popular history book? I could see that being like on the shelves of my Barnes and Noble.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to publish with the trade press. It has its foundations in scholarship, but like I said earlier, I mean, I have no personal or institutional incentive to publish this as a scholarly book,
right?
And it seems like kind of a fun story.
Oh, so you are pitching it as a popular book?
I am pitching it as a popular book.
Oh, cool.
Right? And it's the way I sort of think about it is as an unconventional look on the history of labor and racism in the 19th century. Because basically, at the beginning of the 19th century, most barbers are African-American men, at least in North America. Due to a bunch of circumstances that ultimately result in the hardening of white supremacy over the first half of the 19th century, a lot of white men become more and more uncomfortable with being shaved by a barber of color. And so they take up home shaving, but it turns out that they're really bad at shaving themselves. So they decide that they're going to grow beards instead. And that's like a very reductive version of the basic narrative.
Really? That's funny.
Yeah, but that's... Yeah, so it's sort of like I've been really interested in for some time in the question of whether racist ideas take on a life of their own. Like whatever it seems kind of clear that oftentimes racist ideas are devised to serve some kind of like material or political interest at some point in their history, but it also seems clear to me that those ideas become so prevalent that they have consequences that are vastly removed from whatever original purpose they served. And the fact that like beards result from this history of white supremacy in the United States seems to me a really powerful illustration of the way in which racist ideas take on a life of their own. Wow, that's interesting. I think when you publish your book, you should call it The Beard, a racist idea that took a life of its own, or something like that. It'd be like it would definitely get all the lefty social justice people, and then it would also get like a lot of attention and marketing from all the right wing people, kind of saying this right.
is PC gone run amok. No, I'm just
absolutely, yeah. And when I first published for a sort of general audience about it, yeah, that was like literally the comment online, it turns out that beards are racist now too.
Oh, did you get that? Did you get that? Yeah.
I totally got that. It was like, I'm not saying that your beard in 2014 or whatever is racist. I'm saying that beards in 1840 were racist.
Yeah. So you're kind of saying that your reading of the historical phenomena is that beards kind of become fashionable among white people because they didn't want black barbers at a certain point.
Yeah, because they thought that black barbers were going to murder them. Yeah.
That's interesting. On a totally, this has what I'm going to say has nothing to do with the racial point, but when you think about it, getting it not just haircut, but like your beard trimmed or like your facial hair trimmed with those straight razors, that's a pretty crazy thing to let a stranger do to you. Like
it is absolutely a crazy thing to let a stranger do.
Like, yeah.
It's funny in the entire time that I've been doing this research, I've never actually gotten shaved with a straight razor. Like I've never gone to a barber and had them do it, because after reading all these like weird fantasies about barbers murdering people, I just can't do it. I absolutely cannot do it.
Yep. I don't think I've ever gotten a proper straight razor shave, but I like from someone else. But I had a straight razor for a while, and I did it to myself a few times, which is hard enough and kind of like frightening enough.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it is interesting when you think about it. Like, I guess it makes sense if. If you're in a period of time where like racial antagonisms are like coming to the fore, was it like was it a kind of idea of like, I don't want these black people touching me or doing this to me, or is it more like I'm afraid they're gonna shank me?
No, I mean it's literally like I'm afraid that they're going to murder me, and I mean a lot of it is it seems to be the peculiar power of the Sweeney Todd story, which comes out in the late 1840s.
Really?
Which kind of catalyzes this, and obviously Sweeney Todd, it's a British story. Sweeney Todd is native born English, as far as I can tell from reading the original novel. But as soon as that story crosses the Atlantic, it almost immediately gets the fears of Sweeney Todd get transposed onto black barbers, even though in the British context it's more about working class white barbers. So it's not even like, it just seems to be this moment where we have like a confluence of intensifying white supremacist views on the one hand, and then the arrival of this story that very vividly illustrates what white people think that they're afraid of. Like as far as I can tell, Sweeney Todd, it just kind of arrives at this moment and makes a lot of white people genuinely believe that they're going to be murdered by their barber.
That's really fascinating. Yeah. Well, when you once it's published, as I'm sure it will, maybe you'll come back on the podcast and you can sell it to my like 15 listeners. No.
Yeah. And if I use your title, I guess I owe you like 10% royalty.
Oh, that would be dope. Actually, I could also send you pictures from when I had like a fucking massive, crazy ass, huge kind of like hipster novelty item beard a few years ago.
Nice.
Yeah, it was like completely, one of those like, clearly I just want to look interesting and crazy and badass. I'm going to like grow out this facial hair in a way that looks so ugly and ridiculous, but people are going to think I'm cool and a badass. Yeah, I had one of those for like a year. It was pretty cool.
That sounds pretty awesome. I mean, maybe you could wind up being like the cover art of the book or something.
Yo, dude, if you have like a subsection in there towards the end on like modern like beard movements and race and culture, and like if you have a subsection about how like the meaning and significance of big ass beards among like white urban hipster dudes, I could give you a photo. Like I could legit give you a really good photo that you could probably use as like a textbook case.
You have a deal, Justin. Totally.
That would be awesome. That'll turn out to be like my one claim to fame in life.
That presumes that more than 15 people read the book, which is probably right now that seems like a bit of a strong assumption. So
No. It sounds really good. I feel like those types of books are people love that shit. Like people love history, like interesting, sophisticated, deep histories of like one thing. I feel like that's actually a pretty like popular kind of model right now for a book, and it makes sense because it's like through who was it, like Leibniz, who said you can understand the whole universe through a blade of grass, like by like zooming in really close on one thing. You get this like story of the whole that's actually kind of parsimonious through this one thing. So I can definitely see that. Yeah, that's awesome, man. Well, I'll let you go. We've been talking quite some time now, so this has been really cool. You're a really good conversational sport. You've clearly done this a few times before, I think.
Well, you make it easy. You were an excellent interviewer,
dude. That's awesome. Because
this was a ton of fun, and I like to think that we illustrated your principle of like free speech, absolutism, and charity in our civil disagreements here.
That's a good point. I for sure. I certainly feel like you did. I hope you think I did.
Absolutely.
This was really interesting, Rich. I just love talking with people. I love like turning like a random avatar on social media into like someone who I now ever so slightly kind of know and understand a little bit.
Exactly.
And like, in our own little tiny way, now we're kind of buddies and we had this long conversation. I love that. It's a really cool thing, man. Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. And once Paul and I figure out how to manage like 3 audio streams on Impolitic, we'll have to have you on in turn.
Oh, for sure. Of course. I'd be happy to. Just, let me know. Stay in touch, man.
All right. Sounds good, Justin.
All right,
Thank
see you
you.
later, Sean.